The final cedar plank dropped into place, sealing the cold darkness below. Then came the hammer blows. Hard, steady, heavy, each strike an oath. It was the sound of Phineas Crowell, a homesteader in Wyoming's Powder River Basin, driving the final iron nails into his cabin floor, under the scorching heat of the summer of 1888. Outside, heat shimmered over the dry grasslands. Far north, storm clouds sat low and bruised against the horizon. But beneath the floorboards, another world was taking shape. Nearly 10 feet of packed earth and darkness, a treasure not of gold, but of survival. Potatoes, dried corn, smoked elk, salt pork, and hundreds of pounds of flour stacked high. 800 pounds, every sack weighed by Phineas's own hand. His 5-year-old son, Isaac Crowell, watched with wide, clear eyes. "Pa, why are we hiding food under the house?" Phineas rested his rough hand on the plank, feeling its solid certainty. "Because Snow doesn't care how hungry a man's children are." The men working outside heard him and broke into laughter, the sound sharp and mocking in the dry air. Crowell's burying groceries like they're gold. "Man thinks winter's coming to kill the whole territory." Phineas said nothing. He simply reached for another nail, and the hammering began again, drowning out their scorn. "Do you hear that? That's more than just a hammer. It's the echo of forgotten wisdom." If this story of preparation and foresight resonates with you, hit that like button to spread the message. And be sure to subscribe, because like Phineas, we all have winters of our own to prepare for. Phineas Crowell had not started storing food because he was afraid of winter. Plenty of men feared winter. Most of them still failed to prepare for it. He started because he remembered what hunger looked like after the talking stopped. He had grown up in the foothills of Tennessee, then spent part of his youth riding west with freight caravans and wagon camps moving through Nebraska territory. One winter, when he was barely 17, the supply line failed before Christmas. At first, people stayed confident. They said the roads would open soon, said the snow would break in a week or two. It did not. By February, men were slaughtering horses behind canvas wagons. Children sat beside empty kettles, licking grease from butcher paper, because it tasted like food. That winter stayed with him. So did old Amos Pike, a gray-bearded trapper who survived it. "Winter doesn't kill men in January," Amos once said beside a weak fire. "It kills them in October, when they decide not to prepare." Eleanor Crowell rested a hand against her pregnant stomach while Phineas checked another flour barrel. 800 pounds is enough for 3 families. Phineas tied the sack shut. "Then maybe we'll need enough for 3 families." Clarence Whitmore, the wealthiest cattle baron in the Powder River Basin, held a dinner gathering in late August for ranchers, bankers, freight agents, and anyone important enough to believe the frontier was finally becoming civilized. The table groaned under roasted beef and imported whiskey. Men talked about railroad expansion, new telegraph lines, Eastern contracts, bigger herds, faster money. Clarence Whitmore sat at the head of it all, like a man who believed Wyoming territory had already been conquered. Then someone mentioned Phineas Crowell burying food beneath his cabin floor. The room laughed. Beatrice Whitmore, the cattle baron's sharp-tongued wife raised on Eastern comfort, smiled into her wineglass. A man preparing for the apocalypse with potatoes. Even Clarence laughed at that. "You don't survive the frontier by hiding underground," he said. "You survive it by scaling up." The men nodded. Numbers impressed them. 50,000 cattle sounded stronger than buried flour barrels ever could. But later that night, after the guests rode home, Clarence stood beside the porch rail, watching distant storm clouds gather beyond the prairie. He called for his ranch foreman. "Add a little extra feed this winter," he said quietly, "and buy more flour than usual." The foreman nodded. Clarence looked north one more time, then turned away as if the sky did not matter enough to keep watching. The underground chamber did not work properly the first time Phineas Crowell built it. That was the part nobody in town cared to notice. They saw the finished idea in their minds and laughed at it before the work was even done. But the reality smelled less like genius and more like wet clay, sweat, cedar sap, and charcoal dust clinging to a man's hands long after dark. The first problem came in September. Condensation formed along the lower walls. A few sacks of potatoes began sweating inside the chamber. The cedar hatch warped slightly and stopped sealing tight against the frame. Worse than that, the airflow shaft wasn't pulling enough dry air through the underground space. Moisture gathered in the corners where cold earth pressed against timber braces. Phineas tore half the wall apart and started over. He dug a narrow drainage trench by lantern light, recut the vent angle, repacked charcoal insulation around the cedar supports. Men passing the cabin slowed their horses just long enough to laugh. Man's building a grave for onions. Phineas never looked up from the shovel. By evening, Isaac carried tiny buckets of charcoal down into the chamber beside his father until the boy finally fell asleep against a flour barrel, black dust smeared across his cheeks, while hammer blows still echoed beneath the cabin floor. By October, the Crowell cabin smelled like smoke, salt, drying fruit, and hard work that never fully stopped. Eleanor Crowell spent long afternoons slicing apples into thin, pale rings and laying them across stretched cloth screens near the south window where the dry, Wyoming air could pull the moisture out slowly. Outside, Phineas hung strips of elk meat inside the smoke shed behind the barn, adjusting airflow vents with the care of a machinist tuning gears. Nothing in that cabin was stored randomly. Potatoes were stacked low, where the earth stayed coldest. Carrot crates were buried in cool sand to hold moisture without freezing. Salt pork went into sealed barrels lined with wax cloth. Flour stayed elevated above the chamber floor in case spring thaw ever reached the drainage trench. At night, Phineas sat beside the oil lamp with his ledger open across the table. Calories per pound. Spoilage risk. Cold weather fuel consumption. How much more a pregnant woman needed to survive winter. How quickly a growing child burned through food once temperatures dropped below zero. The arithmetic never really left his mind. One hunting trip nearly ruined 2 weeks of planning. Phineas tracked elk north into Broken Hills after fresh sign appeared near the creek beds. He returned 2 days later with no meat, less ammunition, and a horse limping from shale rock. Time mattered now. So did every missed shot. That night, he opened the ledger again. 513 pounds, 287 to go. Eleanor quietly pushed half her supper back into the stew pot, while Phineas recalculated supply numbers by lamplight, too focused on winter to notice she had already started eating less. Old Amos Pike arrived at the Crowell cabin just before the first hard frost settled across the basin. The old trapper smelled faintly of wood smoke, animal hide, and cold wind that seemed older than the territory itself. He said very little at first, just walked slowly through the underground chamber with a lantern in one hand, studying the cedar braces, the vent shaft, the drainage trench, and the rows of stacked provisions. His weathered fingers pressed against the clay walls. He checked the airflow with the back of his hand. Finally, he nodded once. "You built this like a man expecting winter to stay." Phineas did not answer. Men like Amos Pike did not waste words unless they meant them. The old trapper spoke while looking at the shelves of food. "I saw Snowberry Dakota camps clear into May once. Saw men boil harness leather because they ran out of beans before February. Folks kept saying spring was close." He paused. Close killed more people than cold did. Then his eyes drifted toward Eleanor standing near Isaac's small crib, one hand resting against the child growing inside her. Children make men honest about winter. Before leaving, Amos stopped beside the hatch door. 800 pounds won't feel excessive in February. By late October, most of the Powder River Basin had heard about the food chamber beneath the Crowell cabin. Pastor Eli Mercer addressed it carefully during Sunday service, without ever speaking Phineas Crowell's name aloud. The church stayed silent, while the preacher warned against fear, excessive stockpiling, and placing too much faith in stored goods instead of providence. Everybody understood who he meant. A few days later, Jonah Bell, the owner of the general store near the rail trail, watched Phineas load more flour and dried beans into the wagon bed. Bell frowned at the growing pile. Other folks need food too. Phineas simply placed extra money on the counter. No argument, no defense. That silence irritated people more than excuses would have. Rumors spread faster after that. Crowell preparing for doomsday. Crowell burying half the county underground. Crowell acting like winter was coming for blood. One afternoon, Isaac overheard older boys laughing beside the hitching rail outside the store. Mole Crowell? One of them called his father. The boy stayed quiet during the ride home, staring at the flour sacks beside him while cold church bells drifted across the basin behind them. By the last week of October, Phineas Crowell finished the count. He did it after sundown, when the cabin was quiet and the wind outside had turned thin and metallic. Eleanor sat near the stove, mending Isaac's coat. Isaac slept under 2 quilts, with one small hand hanging over the edge of the bed. Phineas lifted the hatch and climbed down with the lantern. The chamber held potatoes stacked in wooden bins, smoked elk wrapped in clean cloth, cornmeal in sealed sacks, dried beans, flour, rendered fat packed in stone crocks, pickled cabbage sealed tight, dried apples tied in linen, rabbit meat hung from cedar pegs, medicinal herbs bundled high where the damp could not reach them. He weighed what needed weighing. Then he wrote the numbers in the ledger. Potatoes, 180 pounds. Smoked elk and rabbit, 140. Flour and cornmeal, 160. Beans, 90. Salt pork and rendered fat, 110. Pickled cabbage, dried apples, and herbs. The rest, he added at once, then again, then a third time, 812 pounds. Eleanor looked up from the coat when he came back above the floor. Do you finally feel ready? Phineas stood by the window and looked north. The sky was dark, but the horizon had gone pale in that strange way it sometimes does before snow. No, he said. I just feel less unready. That night, after Eleanor and Isaac were asleep, Phineas stayed awake beside the cold glass window. The first snow came without wind. No shouting, no warning. Just white flakes falling straight down in the dark, covering the wagon tracks, the woodpile, the church road, and the place where the men had stood laughing only weeks before. At first, the winter of 1888 did not seem dangerous enough to justify 800 pounds of buried food. November brought light snowfalls and cold mornings that froze the water troughs solid before sunrise. Men cursed while breaking ice with axes, but by afternoon the roads opened again. Smoke still rose from every chimney in town. Freight wagons continued moving south. People quietly decided Phineas Crowell had overreacted. Even December seemed ready to prove them right. A warm spell rolled across the basin just before Christmas. Snow softened and slid from rooftops. Mud appeared beneath wagon wheels. Ranchers laughed again outside the general store while cattle pushed through slush instead of drifts. Clarence Whitmore took it as confirmation. He reopened part of his north grazing range and expanded cattle movement before the deeper snows returned. Men talked about an early break in the season. Then the temperature dropped overnight, fast. Freezing rain swept across the prairie and hardened into a sheet of ice over the grasslands. By morning, the entire basin sounded different. Wagon wheels cracked against frozen ruts. Water buckets froze into solid blocks. Horses slipped crossing packed ground. Worse than that, the cattle could no longer graze. The grass still existed beneath the snow, but now it sat trapped under a hard shell of ice thick enough to stop thousands of animals from feeding. Within days, feed reserves began disappearing twice as fast as expected. Phineas stepped outside before dawn one morning and looked across the glittering crust stretching over the prairie like glass. Now the winter starts. Later that same week, ranch hands watched cattle stumble through the frozen layer, breaking legs against hidden ice beneath the snow, while the gray Wyoming sky lowered itself over the valley like a closing door. The real cold arrived after New Year's. Not ordinary frontier cold. Not the kind men cursed about while chopping wood. This cold came down from the north like something alive. The temperature dropped to -32 first, then -41 for 3 straight nights. The Powder River Basin changed shape under it. Water barrels burst apart. Fence posts cracked. Horses stood with frost gathering around their nostrils like white ash. Entire herds stopped moving unless forced. Then came the sounds in the dark. Sharp, sudden, violent. Rifle cracks echoing across the ridges after midnight. Isaac woke crying the first time he heard them. Eleanor sat upright in bed with both hands around her stomach, while the cabin walls trembled under hard wind gusts. Cottonwood trunks were exploding in the cold, sap freezing inside the wood until the pressure shattered them from within. Phineas was already pulling on boots. He checked the stove draft first, then the hatch seal, then the chamber below the floor. The air felt wrong immediately. The outer vent shaft had started freezing shut from the north side. Thin frost crystals spread around the upper hatch, where moisture was beginning to collect. If the airflow stopped completely, condensation would build inside the chamber. Potatoes would rot, flour would dampen, mold would spread before spring ever arrived. He grabbed the iron rod and went outside. The snow reached nearly to his waist. Wind cut through wool and leather like knives. Breath froze across his beard, while he crawled toward the vent opening in darkness, lit only by lantern glow spilling weakly from the cabin window behind him. Then another tree exploded somewhere beyond the ridge, and another. Phineas stood alone in the drifting snow, listening to the valley break apart under the cold, while frozen iron burned against his hands, and the wind kept coming south. By mid-January, Whitmore Ranch had stopped operating like a business and started operating like a wounded animal. The ice crust across the basin never fully broke. Cattle scraped at frozen ground until their hooves bled, but the grass stayed trapped beneath solid layers of snow and ice. Feed wagons disappeared faster every week. Rail deliveries slowed to almost nothing after repeated storms buried sections of track farther south. Then the hired hands started leaving. Some rode east toward towns with rail stations. Others simply vanished overnight, taking blankets and whatever food they could carry. Clarence Whitmore walked through the main feed barn with snow blowing through gaps in the walls while ranch foremen argued over shrinking supplies. The flour orders should have been doubled in November, Clarence snapped. The foreman looked exhausted. We already stretched credit to buy feed. Feed for cattle, Clarence said, not food for people. Too much money had been tied into beef contracts, too much confidence buried inside herd numbers and future prices. Clarence slammed a gloved fist against a frozen post. I told you to prepare. The foreman stared out across the white fields beyond the barn. Nobody prepares for 6 months of this. Outside, cattle stood frozen along the drift fences, where they had collapsed during the night and never risen again. One massive steer remained upright against the snowbank, stiff and white with frost like a statue carved from winter itself. For the first time since the storms began, Clarence Whitmore thought about the food chamber hidden beneath Phineas Kroll's cabin floor. January settled over the Crowell cabin like a long siege. Every day followed the same hard structure. Phineas fed the horse before sunrise, so the animal would burn less strength in the cold. He rotated potato crates inside the chamber to keep moisture balanced. Checked dried meat for frost crystals. Inspected flour sacks for dampness. Repaired wall chinking, where wind found its way through shrinking timber seams. At night, he updated the ledger beside the stove. 603 pounds remaining. The underground chamber was doing exactly what he designed it to do. The temperature stayed steady beneath the floor despite the brutal cold outside. The charcoal insulation held dryness in the walls. No major spoilage had appeared beyond a few soft potatoes removed early. Nothing had frozen solid. Nothing had rotted. The system worked. That was the good news. The bad news was simpler. Cold changed hunger. Isaac seemed hungry all the time now. The boy woke asking for food and went to sleep asking when breakfast would come again. Eleanor needed larger portions too, as the pregnancy advanced deeper into winter. Calories disappeared faster in hard weather. Phineas adjusted the numbers without mentioning it aloud. Smaller spoonfuls for himself. Less pork in his bowl. More broth than beans. Eleanor noticed within days. She said nothing while steam drifted from thin soup between them. One night, Isaac looked at his father's untouched bread crust beside the lantern and asked quietly, "How come you never take seconds anymore?" The first knock came late one evening near the end of January. Careful, hesitant. Not the knock of neighbors coming to visit. The knock of somebody hoping the door would open before pride failed completely. Phineas already knew who it would be before he reached the latch. The Henderson family stood outside beside a wagon half buried in drift snow. Their two youngest children were wrapped in old feed sacks beneath blankets, stiff with frost. Ice clung to their eyelashes. The father could barely meet Phineas's eyes. "We're short on food," he said quietly, "just until the roads open again." Phineas understood the truth immediately. The roads were not opening soon. The valley's arithmetic had collapsed. He brought them inside without questions. Eleanor packed potatoes into cloth sacks, while Phineas measured dried beans, smoked rabbit meat, and rendered fat onto the scale beside the hatch. Nobody mentioned repayment. The youngest Henderson child never spoke at all. He only stared silently at the hanging strips of smoked meat near the stove, with the fixed attention of someone too hungry to hide it anymore. After the wagon disappeared back into the storm, Phineas reopened the ledger by lamplight, 547 pounds remaining. For the first time since winter began, he understood something the chamber beneath the floor had never been built to do. It was designed for 4 people, not an entire valley. Word spread across the Powder River Basin faster than freight wagons ever could. The Crowell cabin still had food. After the Henderson family came the Petersons. Then Widow Keene with 2 boys and a sack of frozen turnips that had already started rotting. 2 ranch hands arrived after losing work at Whitmore Ranch. A young couple appeared carrying infant twins wrapped together beneath one blanket because they no longer had enough cloth to separate them. By February, Phineas Crowell had stopped thinking like a homesteader and started thinking like a quartermaster trapped inside a siege, calories by family size, extra fat for children, smaller bean portions during mild days, larger meal allowances before blizzards. Everything became arithmetic. He weighed food carefully beside the hatch, while snow hammered against the cabin walls outside. 472 pounds remaining, then 431, then 389. The numbers no longer dropped slowly. At night, after Eleanor and Isaac slept, Phineas recalculated survival odds beside the dying lantern flame. If winter broke in April, survival remained possible. If snow lasted into May, things became dangerous. If June came before the thaw, the math failed completely. One evening, Eleanor watched the mother of the infant twins thin a pot of soup with melted snow so both children could swallow a few extra spoonfuls. After they left, she turned away from the table and quietly cried where Phineas could not see her face, while another line of snow-covered wagon tracks disappeared into the white darkness outside. Beatrice Whitmore arrived at the Crowell cabin during the second week of February, not in a polished carriage with ranch hands riding beside her. She came alone on an exhausted horse with ice frozen into its mane. The expensive Boston coats and tailored gloves were gone now, replaced by practical wool layers wrapped tight against the cold. Even from the window, Eleanor could see the change winter had carved into her face. Beatrice looked thinner, older. Phineas opened the door before she knocked twice. For a moment, she simply stood there, letting warm cabin air hit her cheeks while snow melted slowly from her scarf. Then she admitted the truth. The Whitmore feed stores were collapsing. Supply trains had stopped coming through the basin. Thousands of cattle were dead already. More were dying every week, and her children were hungry. Phineas stepped aside and let her enter without a word. Beatrice looked around the cabin in silence, hanging meat near the stove. Organized sacks stacked along the walls. Dry firewood, stable warmth. The cedar hatch built into the floor like part of the house itself. Everything she once mocked now looked more valuable than cattle contracts or rail investments. Phineas filled 2 sacks himself. Beans, potatoes, smoked rabbit, rendered fat. Beatrice watched him work with lowered eyes. "I laughed at you," she whispered. Phineas tied the last sack closed. "Your children didn't." After that, Beatrice stood staring at the underground hatch for several long seconds, almost like a woman standing before an altar built for a god she had spent too many years refusing to believe in. By late February, the numbers finally became impossible to ignore. 311 pounds remaining. Phineas Crowell checked the arithmetic 3 separate times after midnight, while the wind pushed snow against the cabin walls hard enough to shake loose dust from the rafters. If he stopped giving food away, his own family could probably survive until May. Probably. If the current distributions continued, The math turned ugly before spring. Then Isaac developed a fever. Not severe at first, just flushed cheeks, shallow coughing, and restless sleep beneath heavy quilts. But winter had already taught everyone in the basin how quickly small problems became graves once hunger and cold worked together long enough. Eleanor looked weaker too. Her pregnancy had advanced into the hardest stretch of winter, and one evening, Phineas finally noticed what she had been hiding for weeks. She was cutting her own meals, almost in half. The realization hit him harder than the cold ever had. That night, after both Eleanor and Isaac were asleep, Phineas climbed down into the chamber alone, carrying only a lantern. The underground room felt still and heavy beneath the storm above. He touched the potato crates one by one, counted flour sacks by hand, ran his fingers across jars sealed before winter began, back when numbers still looked large enough to trust. Above him, wind groaned through the cabin floorboards. Then Isaac coughed upstairs. A small sound, but it carried through the wood like a nail driven into bone. For the first time all winter, Phineas considered sealing the hatch permanently. No more neighbors, no more food bundles, no more dividing survival into smaller pieces. Just his family, just enough. He sat there in the lantern glow, staring at the remaining sacks while snow hammered the roof overhead. Then another thought came. What was the point of surviving winter if a man became the kind of creature who listened to hungry children outside his door and did nothing? Phineas closed the ledger. A few minutes later, he climbed back upstairs. The decision had already been made. March arrived, but the winter refused to recognize the calendar. Another blizzard rolled down across the Powder River Basin and buried the fences almost completely. Smoke from cabin chimneys flattened low against the white sky instead of rising. Wagon roads vanished again, beneath drifting snow deep enough to swallow old trail markers whole. The basin no longer looked inhabited. It looked buried. By then, Phineas Kroll had reduced himself to one real meal a day. At night, he drank thin bean broth beside the stove, while Eleanor pretended not to notice how slowly he ate. The chamber beneath the floor held only 207 pounds now. Children across the valley had begun wearing hunger openly on their faces, hollow cheeks, slow movement, eyes following food before people. Arithmetic no longer favored survival. Not for him. Not for anyone. But still the knocking continued. Phineas kept giving away dried apples, rendered fat, preserved vegetables, whatever could keep children alive through another storm cycle. Every bundle carried out into the snow made the ledger more dangerous by morning. One afternoon, a small girl from the Peterson family stared silently at the jar of dried apples in Phineas's hands, while Isaac watched from beside the stove. Those apples had been Isaac's favorite food all winter. Phineas handed the jar to the girl anyway. Outside, the wind buried another section of fence line, while winter kept pressing down on the valley like it intended to stay forever. Clarence Whitmore came to the Kroll cabin alone near the end of March. Not as the richest cattle baron in the Powder River Basin, as a tired father who had finally run out of explanations. Snow covered the shoulders of his coat when Phineas opened the door. His gloves looked stiff with cold and use, not polished like they once had at summer gatherings before winter stripped the territory down to what actually mattered. Clarence stepped inside slowly. The warm air, the organized shelves, the hanging meat, the careful, calm inside the cabin. All of it said the same thing more clearly than words ever could. Phineas Kroll had been right. Clarence stared at the food bundles near the hatch, but could not quite bring himself to look directly at them. "I saw the danger too late," he admitted quietly. "Trusted scale too much. Thought money could outrun weather." He gave a bitter laugh that sounded older than the man himself. "You prepared like winter was real." Phineas finished tying a sack of potatoes before answering. "Winter's always real." He handed the food over. "Most years, it's just merciful." Clarence took the sack with both hands. Then he left carrying food through the snowstorm, while whatever remained of his pride stayed behind in the warmth of the Crowell cabin. April brought the first dangerous signs of hope. Snow began dripping from roof edges during the afternoon. Mud appeared beneath wagon ruts near the barn. Once or twice, sunlight pushed through the gray sky long enough to make people believe winter was finally weakening. Then another storm came, harder than the last one. Wind erased the roads again overnight and buried fresh mud beneath new layers of snow like spring itself had been smothered before it could breathe. That evening, Phineas opened the ledger beside the candlelight. 96 pounds remaining. The numbers looked smaller now than they ever had before. For a long time, he stared at the page without speaking, while wind hissed against the cabin walls outside. Finally, quietly, he admitted the truth to Eleanor. "If snow lasts another month, we may not make it." Eleanor sat across from him, wrapped in blankets, one hand resting against the child still growing inside her despite the hunger and cold surrounding the basin. She looked at him for several seconds before answering, "Then we make it one day at a time." Her voice stayed calm, "Same as everyone else you kept alive." It was the first time anyone had spoken aloud what Phineas had actually done that winter. He looked down at the untouched piece of bread beside his bowl. Without a word, Eleanor slid it back toward him across the table, while melting snow dripped steadily from the cabin roof outside into the dark Wyoming mud below. The sound that woke Phineas Crowell in early May was so unfamiliar that for a moment he did not recognize it. Water. Not frozen water cracking in barrels. Not sleet striking the roof. Not ice shifting beneath wagon wheels. Running water. He sat upright in bed, listening carefully while pale morning light pushed through the cabin window. Beside him, Eleanor still slept beneath heavy blankets. Isaac lay curled near the stove with one arm stretched across the floorboards. Outside, something had changed. Phineas opened the door and stepped into cold mud instead of hard snow. The drifts were softening at the edges. Water dripped steadily from the roofline. Farther downhill, the creek moved again beneath broken sheets of gray ice that had trapped it for months. Winter was finally retreating. Not defeated, just finished. Phineas climbed down into the chamber one more time, carrying the ledger and lantern. The underground cold remained steady. The shelves looked emptier now. Barrels stood farther apart. Crates no longer crowded the walls. He counted slowly. Beans, flour, potatoes, rendered fat. Then he wrote the final number. 41 pounds remaining. From 812. For several long seconds, Phineas simply stared at the page, while the sound of running water echoed faintly beyond the cabin walls overhead. Almost exactly 6 months. The exact amount of winter he had prepared for. Not excessive, not paranoid, barely enough. Before climbing back up, Phineas rested one rough hand against the cedar hatch above him like a man thanking something that had carried his family through the dark. Spring uncovered what the winter had really done to the Powder River Basin. Once the snow retreated far enough for wagons to move again, the losses became impossible to hide. Thousands of cattle lay scattered across open range country, like driftwood left behind after a flood. Ranch bankruptcies spread from valley to valley. Supply chains that people trusted all summer had collapsed almost completely during the storms. Some homesteads stood abandoned with doors swinging loose in the wind because the families inside had finally given up and gone east. The frontier looked older after that winter. Harder, quieter, and slowly, people began copying Phineas Crowell. Men who once mocked the underground chamber beneath his cabin floor started digging their own storage pits before the spring thaw had even fully dried. Wagons hauled root vegetables instead of luxury goods. Smoke sheds rose behind cabins across the basin. Meat preservation became more important than cattle prices. Even Jonah Bell changed his store inventory. The same shelves that once carried extra whiskey and imported goods now held salt barrels, sealing wax, preservation crocks, root cellar tools, and sacks of hardy winter potatoes. Pastor Eli Mercer changed too. His sermons no longer spoke about blind faith overcoming hardship. Now he preached stewardship, preparation, and responsibility for the people depending on a man's decisions before winter arrived. Eventually, Beatrice Whitmore left Wyoming Territory with her children, after the Whitmore losses became too large to recover from fully. But years later, she still told them the same thing, whenever hard seasons came. The smartest man in this valley hid food under the floor. And all across the basin, men who once laughed outside the Crowell cabin could now be found kneeling in spring mud with measuring ropes in hand, calculating cellar depth before the next winter had a chance to speak again. Late spring settled slowly across the Powder River Basin. Snow still clung to the distant hills, but the lower ground had softened enough for planting. Mud stuck heavy to boots. The creek ran loud again. Wind carried the smell of wet earth instead of ice. Phineas Crowell stood behind the cabin, turning over rows of soil, with a shovel worn smooth from years of work. The motion looked familiar. Steel biting earth, hands pressing downward, another season beginning beneath the ground. Isaac followed behind him, dropping cut seed potatoes into the open rows, one piece at a time, with serious concentration, as if the task mattered too much for a child to do carelessly. Because now it did. Eleanor sat on the porch watching them, with one hand resting against the child soon to arrive before summer. The basin around them had changed after that winter. People prepared differently now, spoke differently, counted differently, but Phineas himself had changed less than anyone expected. He did not celebrate surviving, did not speak proudly about being right. He simply kept preparing. Because winter had never really been the enemy. The real danger was believing nature would always be merciful simply because it had been merciful before. Isaac looked up from the potato rows. "Are we hiding food again this year?" Phineas drove the shovel into the earth once more. No. He pulled another strip of dark soil open beneath the Wyoming sun. "We're making sure winter has to work harder next time." And somewhere far beyond the green edge of spring, the mountains still held snow, waiting for another season to decide what kind of men would survive it. How many people do you think would have survived that winter if they had buried food under the floor before the snow came?